as we look at the final chapter of the flood narrative, the final chapter of the flood narrative, the final issue, the final issues that wrap up the life of Noah, we see this common theme that has come about. We see that despite the flood, mankind has multiplied on the earth, and yet sin continues to affect all men. Mankind multiplies on the earth, and yet sin continues to affect all men. The issue of the flood did not solve the major problem of sin. The judgment of the flood did not solve the major problem of sin that affects the world. How do we know this? Well, we can see in verses 18 and 19 that all men share a common ancestry. And then in verse 20 through 27, we see that sin has a great and powerful effect upon the world. Let's begin with the first point, mankind's common ancestry. Mankind shares a common ancestry. Look at verse 18. Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. What do we find here? We find an editorial insert in the text. Like, this is not what we would expect as we were listening to a narrative. I mean, because we just finished talking about this great, we just finished reading, rather, this great discussion between God and Noah and the covenant. And then all of a sudden, we move from that dialogue to what is an editorial insert. Why does Moses do this? Why does he put this in here? Well, first of all, it should point the reader back to the declaration that God made in chapter 9, verse 1. Look back with me, chapter 9, verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So here in verses 18 and 19, Moses is communicating to the reader that in fact happened. Noah and his sons obeyed the command of God by filling the earth. You see, verse 19, these were the three sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. What is Moses' point then? His point is to emphasize that the entire population of the world came from the sons of Noah. Notice, he names them again in verse 18. They were Shem, they were Ham, and they were Japheth. And he re-emphasizes that these are the only sons of Noah. They were the only children of Noah who survived the flood. In fact, we'll find out later in this passage that these are, in fact, quite possibly the only children that Noah actually had. And so what is the point of application that we can take from this? The point of application is this: every person alive today has a common ancestry. And we can trace our ancestry back to one of the three sons of Noah. You were either of the family line of Shem, or the family line of Japheth, or the family line of Ham. Ultimately, you were of the family line of Noah. And who was Noah a part of the family line of? Adam. And so this is a very important editorial insertion to help remind the audience, the original audience, Israel, that they are related to all their neighbors because they share a common ancestry. Now, we can draw two truths from these verses. The first truth is this, that there is a powerful unity within mankind. Think about that. When you look at mankind and you see the great diversity of faces, of hair color, of skin color, of shapes. You can see that there is a great diversity, but also there's a powerful unity. Why? Because we all came from the same three individuals who all came from one man, Noah. And so there's a powerful unity. No matter where you live right now on this planet, you share a common ancestry, and it traces all the way back to Noah. And the second truth is the opposite of this, right? The second truth is that within this great unity comes an incredible diversity. Now, I recognize that the word diversity has become somewhat of a bad word in our culture. Diversity is a bad word amongst the people that we share a intellectual and theological sphere with, because diversity often means compromise. Diversity has been redefined to mean we have to accept everybody's viewpoint as equally valid. But we need to understand that that's not the basic meaning of the word diversity. The basic meaning of the word diversity is that within one kind, there can be a great variety of shapes and sizes and appearances. And so when you think about, as I already mentioned, how different we look externally, when you think about how various the complexions and the shapes and sizes and the skill sets of the human race are, when you think about that, it blows your mind to imagine that they all came from the same three fathers, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then what should you do with that, though? How should you process that? Well, as I thought about it this week, I thought this. Out of this great unity comes this great diversity, which reveals the infinite mind of the Creator. Only a being like Yahweh God could design in the DNA of a species, of a kind, this great diversity, and yet there is tremendous unity there. And so it was very providential that our brother Mike discussed the issue of how many parts are in a drop of blood, and the great design and care that went into that before his prayer this morning. Because if you just think, well, that's one drop of blood, look at all the rest of your body. Look at all the intricacies that comprise you as an individual. And there is an incredible unity there, and yet programmed within that unity is this great diversity, and that speaks to the infinite mind of a creator God who did this for his glory. You see, he didn't do it because he just fancied to do it. He did it because it would point to his glory, to his authority, to his superiority, to his infinite nature and powerful creativity. And so as we read these two verses, it's kind of like almost flippant in the text. You're just kind of like reading along the text and you're like, oh yeah, the sons of Noah came out of the ark, and from these three men, the whole earth was populated. Okay. Well, no, when you stop and think about it, this communicates a very powerful truth that mankind has a common ancestry, and out of that common ancestry comes the great diversity that we see in life today. And so after the flood, mankind multiplies on the earth, as reflected in these particular verses. But the flood, the judgment of the flood, doesn't deal with mankind's basic ailment, because sin continues to affect all men. And we see in verses 20 through 27 the consequences of sin. All right, so verse 20. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both of their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. We have here an example of sin affecting a godly man and sin affecting a wicked man, an ungodly man. And so what should we learn from that? Just in general, that sin continues to affect every person. The most righteous person and the most wicked heathen are both affected by sin and its power. The first thing we should observe from this text is that even great men of faith stumble into sin. And I use that word stumble appropriately. Noah was tripped up. Okay, this was purposeful, but he was tripped up. All right? How was he tripped up? Well, he displayed a lack of self-control. He displayed a lack of discipline. He displayed a carelessness about the substance that he was using, namely wine. And because he lacked self-control and he lacked discipline and he was careless, he ended up becoming drunk. And so, is this story a condemnation of farming or planting a vineyard, or even enjoying the fruits of the vineyard known as wine? No, it's not a condemnation of those things. It's a warning that even godly men can use the things that God provides in a way that is sinful. And that's what Noah did. Noah used something that was good and appropriate, but he used it to the extent that it became sinful to him. Now, this event probably took place a number of years after the flood. I did some research this week on how long it takes to grow grapes that are ready to turn into wine. And the minimum is 3 years if you're starting with a shoot of a vine. It's longer if you start with a seed. Now, we don't know whether Noah started with a seed or with a shoot, but a minimum time frame would be 3 years. More likely, it's 7 to 10 years later. 7 to 10 years. It could be even later than that. But this wasn't like the first thing that he did after the flood. It was like Noah came out of the boat, he worshiped Yahweh as we discussed last week, and then he just began living life normally. He began doing what he had always done. And apparently he was a farmer. So he was farming. This says a couple things, okay? First of all, his actions are totally out of character considering what we've learned about him thus far. Everything that we have read about Noah from Genesis chapter 6, Genesis chapter 7, Genesis chapter 8, and up to this point in Genesis chapter 9 can be summed up in this phrase found in Genesis chapter 6, that Noah was a righteous man, blameless, and he walked with Yahweh. Now, as we already mentioned a few weeks ago, this does not mean he was sinless, okay? But it means that he was walking in obedience to God. We imagine he was probably regularly offering offerings to God. He was regularly confessing his sins to God. And before the flood, God chose not to reveal any of the sins of Noah. But after the flood, God chooses to reveal this particular sin. Why might God include this story? Certainly, this doesn't help to elevate the person of Noah in our minds. It's actually quite shocking. Because here's a man who walked all these years well. And then towards the end of his life, we find this story. There's a couple of reasons. There's a theological reason that we'll get to when we discuss the blessings and the curse in verses 25 through 27. But there's a more practical reason as well. One of the practical reasons that God would include this story is that it is a reminder that Noah indeed was not perfect. There is only one perfect man who has ever lived on the face of the earth, and his name is Jesus Christ. You see, if this story wasn't in here, we might be tempted to think that Noah was this perfect individual. Now, we know theologically that's not true, but there's nothing in the text that tells us that he did anything that was sinful. So here we find an example of Noah and a great sin. So that's one reason why this story, it is a reminder to us that Noah was not perfect. Another reason that God might include this particular sordid tale from the life of Noah, this tale serves as a warning to those who have faith. Proverbs 16:18 says this, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling." Be careful not to be prideful, for you could sin in the way that you never think is possible. Now, we don't know if pride was an issue for Noah. That's not revealed in the text. I'm not trying to say that it is, but I'm saying this passage stands as a warning to those who are faithful. Don't think that a certain sin cannot happen to you. Be humble. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction. If you think, I will never sin in this way, I could never do this, I would never ever do that, maybe the Lord would decide to allow Satan to test you like Satan tested Job. And would you then pass the test? Rather say, Lord, your servant is weak, your servant is frail. You know I have many temptations. Please keep me from temptation. Isn't that one of the basic truths found in the Lord's Prayer? Lead me not into temptation. Keep it far from me. A third practical reason that God might include this story of Noah is that this story serves as a comfort to those who may have sinned greatly. It serves as a comfort to those who may have sinned greatly. Think about it. Did God just cast Noah away after this particular incident? Was God just done with him? Did God say, that's it, you're done, I'm out. You're on your own. I'm revoking your salvation. No, God did not do that to Noah. And so this story serves as a comfort to those who have sinned. And we can know this. When one of God's servants who is faithful commits a gross and public sin, there is often an overwhelming sense of embarrassment and an overwhelming sense of failure. And you believe that you cannot be used by God again. This is why, not only in the story of Noah, but throughout the rest of biblical history, we see examples of great servants of God who sin publicly, and yet God continues to use them for ministry. First that comes to my mind is Peter, who denied our Lord 3 times on the night of his trial. That was very public. Why did that come about for Peter? Because of pride. Lord, I will never deny you. Oh yeah? Watch this. We'll give Satan permission to sift you, Peter, and see what really happens. Abraham was a man who sinned publicly. He lied multiple times about the identity of his wife, Sarah. He committed the sin with Hagar and had a child out of wedlock. Abraham did some other things, and yet God continued to use him. Were there consequences? Yes. But did God continue to use them? Yes. Did they maintain their salvation? Yes. Were they restored in their faith? Yes. And so when we see these stories, it is encouraging to us when we ourselves sin, because we know that if God could restore these servants, then God can also restore you personally. In contrast to Noah's sin, we see Ham in verse 22, who is the father of Canaan, delighting in sin. So though the men of faith may stumble into sin, though we may have a lapse of judgment, though we may give into the temptations, that's not our normal character. That was not the normal character of Noah to sin in this way. Yet we find in verse 22 that it appears his son Ham had a reputation and was known for being a wicked man. Ham, verse 22, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Ham was the youngest son of Noah, and he saw his father wallowing in sin inside the tent. There, Noah had become drunk. He had taken off all of his clothes. He was lying there, apparently in the opening of the tent for all to see, and Ham witnesses this situation that his father found himself in. And it says he saw the nakedness of his father, and he told his two brothers outside. Now, I think one of the great mysteries surrounding this particular text is, what is the specific sin of Ham, and why does this sin result in Noah giving such a harsh punishment to his descendants? Because if you remember in our reading, we skip down to verse 25, Noah curses Ham's son, not Ham himself, okay? So let's just try, first of all, to answer the question, what is the specific sin of Ham from the text itself, all right? What is it? Well, first of all, we can discern from the text that he evidently delighted in seeing his father's nakedness. He took some kind of delight and satisfaction in it. Now, whether that was a sexual delight or whether he was happy that his father had finally given in and finally sinned publicly, and, sometimes sons can resent their fathers when their fathers are men of great integrity, and you're not. Maybe he's finally, dad is down at my level. He could have had that type of satisfying glance at his father. He engaged in some type of voyeurism, which is the practice of gaining some sexual pleasure from seeing others who are naked. This in and of itself is wrong, but it's additionally distressing that he viewed his father this way. This is a shameful breach of honor. Your parents are to be respected, honored, treated with the utmost respect, and by him gazing and looking upon his father's nakedness, he not only took some kind of delight in that, but his gaze lasted too long enough to be some type of voyeurism. And then thirdly, we see him engaging in the sin of slanderous gossip. Okay, so it's one thing. You're walking by your father's tent, you glance in, and you see that your father is lying naked and drunk on the floor or on his bed. What should be your first instinct? Your first instinct should be, I can't believe this is the situation of my father. Let me help my father. Let me close the curtain of the tent. Let me go cover my father up. Let me do something that will protect the dignity and honor of my father. But instead, what does Ham do? He goes and finds his two brothers. Hey guys, let me tell you what dad did. Go check out dad. You guys think dad is this man of great integrity? You think dad has the in with God? Go look at him now in his tent. Then tell me what you think. Ham was slandering and gossiping about his father. These are the truths that we can discern from the text. And we know that his gaze, the look that he gave, was a sinful gaze, and it dishonored his father because it is contrasted with the response of Shem and Japheth. Look at verse 23. What do? Shem and Japheth take a garment, and they lay it upon both of their shoulders, and they walk backward into the tent, and they cover the nakedness of their father. They keep their faces turned away. So this is a challenging thing, okay? They're getting a garment. One guy is over here and one guy is here. They're putting the garment over their shoulders, probably have their arms out extended, and they're walking backwards into the tent, and they're just draping this garment over their father. And then they're walking forward. And the text seems to indicate that they were very careful not to look upon the nakedness of their father at all. They didn't want to be tempted. They knew the temptation was there. They didn't want to give in to the temptation, so they kept their eyes away. So what specific sins did Ham commit here? Well, let's turn a little bit further into the writings of Moses to discern some of these sins. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3. Listen to what this says. Leviticus 19:3. Every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Did Ham do that? No. He did not reverence his mother or his father. Now, let's turn back to Exodus chapter 20. Upon the first receipt of the law given by God to Moses and then to the Israelites, here is what the law says. Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. I like how the Apostle Paul states this particular command in Ephesians chapter 6. You don't have to turn here. I'll turn here and read this to you. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Verse 2. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Notice what is connected to honoring your father and mother. This promise of living long on the earth and that things would go well with you. Now, of course, this is a general truth, okay? And it was given primarily to the nation of Israel, but Paul brings it all the way forward to the church age, and we can see the evidence of this playing out in society today. Honor your father and mother so that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. Ham disobeyed that command. Now, Proverbs chapter 20, verse 19 says this, written by Solomon, hundreds of years after this particular incident. Proverbs 20:19, he who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with a gossip. One of the main sins that Ham committed was slanderous gossip. And Solomon says, don't even associate with this kind of individual. And finally, if we look in Leviticus chapter 18 and Leviticus chapter 20, we don't have time to read all of these, we can see that God requires sexual purity in every area of life. Those verses communicate that truth very plainly to us. I think those are the sins of Ham, which can be discerned plainly from the text. And I hope to have shown them to you. Now, if you were to spend some hours researching this topic, I think that there are 4 additional possibilities of sin that you would discover. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to go home and look up that question and think that, well, Pastor Jonathan missed a whole bunch of possibilities. No, I know what the possibilities are, but I don't think they're worth bringing to you in this particular format, okay? Each of the 4 possibilities that you will discover require, number 1, a lot of explanation regarding textual matters. Number 2, all of them are sexual in nature, and therefore, number 3, they're not age appropriate for this particular setting, okay? So if you as an adult go home and research this and find out there's more possibilities, you've done well, okay? Just know that those aren't quite appropriate for this audience or this setting, okay? I think the three things that we've discerned from the text, some kind of sexual voyeurism, some kind of dishonoring, and some kind of slanderous gossip, those are enough for us to discern that the sins of Ham were serious. Now, in contrast to how the wicked delight in sin, the righteous reject the invitation to sin. And I've already discussed with you how Shem and Japheth were very careful about protecting their father's integrity and protecting their father's honor by walking backwards into the tent to cover him up. What I want to say about that as a point of application is this: the righteous are always careful to build ways, strategies, walls that would prevent them from sinning. Okay, so the righteous will develop strategies. They will place boundaries into effect. They will seek accountability so that they don't stumble into sin. Think about it. These two men did this together. There was an accountability there. Are you looking? No, I'm not looking. Are you looking? No, I'm not looking, right? There's an accountability there. And they rejected the invitation to sin. Now we come to the conclusion of this particular episode in verse 24. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. It's hard for us to discern how Noah figured out what his youngest son had done to him. We don't know that. The text leaves it unstated. But the text does say that he discovered it. And so he knew the way that his son Ham had dishonored him. Now, before we go to his response, I want to draw your attention to a summary of how the wicked treat sin. How do wicked people treat sin? All right, from this story, we learn four things. Number one, wicked people enjoy sin. Number two, wicked people try to persuade others to join them in sin. Number three, wicked people will be found out by their sin. It will not go hidden forever. And this leads us to number four, which we will discover in verse 25. Wicked people will suffer the consequences of their sin. So lest you think that you can sin and get away with it, here's what God says. If you're wicked, you'll enjoy sin and you'll try to persuade others to get to sin with you, but you'll be found out by it and you will suffer the consequence. And what is the consequence for every person who sins? Just in a general sense, based on what we know from the New Testament, what is the consequence? What does God say? Death. 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 And we just got done looking at the flood narrative, which described the death of every person on earth except for 8, and all the animals on the earth that were not in the ark. Is there a better contrast to, hey, here is sin, and here's what happens if you sin? Can you draw a more straight line, or could you highlight it in any more spectacular way than coming out of this particular narrative? Death is the consequence of sin, and it's not just a physical death. It is a spiritual death. It is a spiritual death that will last for all of eternity. The wages of sin is death. So, in other words, because of our sin, we have earned this particular consequence. We deserve this particular consequence in the same way as if you work for your company and your company pays you on payday, you earned that wage. All of us, because we are sinners by nature, we are sinners from our very conception as human beings in our mother's womb, and we sin when we come out of the womb, and all of life is consumed with sin. We're not as wicked as we could be, but everything is tainted by sin. Because of that, God had to provide a means to pay for this sin. And that means came in the person of his son, Jesus Christ. We already mentioned one of the reasons that Noah had this story recorded was so that people wouldn't think he was perfect. Jesus has no such stories recorded about him. Perfect, sinless, the acceptable sacrifice, the Lamb of God who, through the shedding of his blood, would take away the sins of the world. And he did, in fact, do that on the cross of Calvary and was placed into the grave, and then 3 days later raised from the dead by the power of God the Father. And all those who would see that reality and who would accept that truth and would confess their sins and put their hope in Jesus can find forgiveness in their sins, and they will no longer face as the wages of sin death, but rather they would have the gift of eternal life through the blood of Christ. My friends, if you don't know what the consequences of your sin will be for all of eternity, I pray that you would come talk to myself or one of the other pastors. Make sure that you know and understand what you will face for eternity based on the choices and decisions that you've made right here and right now. Now we turn to verse 25 and we see that Noah speaks for the first time in this whole narrative. Noah speaks for the first time. What does he say? Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. And he also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Here we have the first of what will become a theme throughout the book of Genesis, of curses and blessings. Curses and blessings. This is an important theme in the book of Genesis. It's an important theme throughout the Old Testament. You need to understand this, that God curses those who disobey him, and God blesses those who obey him. Curses for disobedience, blessings for obedience. And here is the first example of that, kind of setting the foundation of this here in Noah's response to his son Ham. Now, another intriguing question that we have to answer and deal with, okay? Another intriguing question is, why does Noah curse Canaan, who is actually the son of Ham? Why does he curse Canaan? Why doesn't he curse Ham himself? Well, I think the best answer comes from looking back in the text and seeing that in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, what it happens? God blessed Noah and his sons. So Ham was already under the blessing of God. Ham had already received a blessing from God. Now, do you think that Noah, in providing a curse, could somehow overrule that blessing from God? I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think that because of the nature of this particular sin, it was appropriate for the offspring of Ham to be cursed, and Noah chose to curse Canaan. This was both prophetic, in other words, God wanted him to because of the plan that he had for Canaan, and it was appropriate. Moving forward again into the law, in Deuteronomy 27:16, Moses writes this, "Cursed is he who dishonors his father or mother." So it is appropriate for a curse to be spoken to the one who dishonors his father or his mother. And because Ham was already blessed by God, it was not possible for Noah to curse his first, or that son, his youngest son, Ham. So he cursed Canaan, Ham's son. It was his grandson. And what was the curse? A servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. So Canaan would have a place of lowliness. He would never have a place of prominence. He was destined to be a servant of servants to his brothers. Now, how does this play out? Look at the blessing. Okay, verse 26. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Verse 27. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. So the specific servitude that Canaan would have was not to his natural brothers, that would be his other brothers born from Ham. Okay, if we turn over in Genesis chapter 10, we can see in verse 6, the sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim and Put and Canaan. The curse was not for those sons. Canaan was not to be the servant of those. He was rather to be the servant of what were in effect his uncles. Okay? His brothers through Ham's family tree. Shem was to be his brother. Japheth was to be his brother. And he was to be a servant to Shem and a servant to Japheth. Moses, in bringing this curse upon Canaan, speaks again prophetically. Why? Because who do the Canaanites become? The Ammonites, the Perizzites, the Philistines. They become all the Ite peoples who populate what land? The promised land, known as the land of Canaan. And who is to be the recipient of the promised land? Abraham and his descendants. And so there's a prophecy contained here within this curse, and it is about the conflict that will occur between Canaan and his descendants and Shem and his descendants. And Shem is the father of Abraham, and Abraham, of course, is the father of the nation of Israel. Now, I find it very interesting here that Noah says in verse 27, may God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. In verse 26, the way he blesses Shem is by blessing Yahweh. He said, blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem, communicating to us that Shem is a believer and that the promise of the Redeemer should flow through his lineage. But then when we get to Japheth, it's like, may God enlarge Japheth. So, in other words, he's asking that God would give Japheth many peoples and many lands. And yet, despite the fact that he is going to become enlarged, he is still going to dwell in the tents of Shem. His ultimate blessing comes from his relationship to Shem. How does this play out? How does this play out? Well, because we have the whole story, we can go to Romans chapter 11, and we can see this, that Japheth is really the father of many of the Gentile nations who existed during the first century. He was the father of Europeans. He was the father of the Romans, the Greeks, and the father of some other peoples of that nature. How were those people blessed? How did they dwell in the tents of Shem? Well, whose line did the Redeemer come through? Shem's line. He's the original root. He's the original tree. But what did God do? God broke off some of the natural branches of that root. And God grafted on some branches that were not the natural branches. Those are the Gentiles. That's you and I. That's how Shem dwells, that's how Japheth dwells in the tents of Shem. Because God took some of those who were not his people and he grafted them into the branch, and now they are called my people. What an amazing prophecy to see how this has been fulfilled thousands of years after it was spoken. Sin always has consequences, but obedience also has its consequences, which are the blessings that were received by Shem and Japheth. Now, finally, we come to Noah's last moments, last days. It's interesting. Verse 28 says, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. You know, there are some possible consequences to Noah's sin that we might be able to discern from the text. What's different about Noah's final genealogical record compared to his foreparents? You know, Seth lived X number of years, and he begat so-and-so, and then he had other sons and daughters, and then he died. Methuselah lived so many years, and he begat so-and-so, and then he lived this many more years and had other sons and daughters, and he died. Notice, it doesn't say that Noah had any more sons and daughters. Now, just because the text is silent doesn't mean he didn't have them. But it seems curious that in the genealogical pattern, all the other patriarchs, all the other pre-Diluvian, pre-flood fathers are recorded as having a son of promise and then other sons and daughters, and that's not true for Noah. Maybe one of the consequences to his sin is that he wasn't allowed to have any more children. We don't know for sure. But he lives another 350 years. He's able to see the repopulation of the earth, and I believe that Noah has the blessing of dying prior to the next great rebellion committed by mankind, found in chapter 11 in the Tower of Babel. But what do we see ultimately? So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Sin still has its ultimate effect upon Noah. He died. Sin will have its ultimate effect on every person right now. Accepting the fact that the Lord Jesus returns and rescues the church from this world, all of us will taste death at some point as the natural consequence for sin. My friends, as we consider this story, a couple of things to think about as we conclude. Number one, you should praise God for the great creative power that he has demonstrated to us. Even just looking at the mass of humanity and our great diversity and variety, and yet the unity that we share. God deserves all the glory for that. Secondly, we should be humble. We should never think that we're above any sin. We should rather seek to ask God to protect us from sin and to lead us not into temptation. Thirdly, we should recognize that the wicked will always entice others to sin. Do not join with them. Memorize Proverbs chapter 1, where Solomon writes, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Do not go with them. Do not cast your lot with them." You cannot escape the enticement of sin. You cannot escape being around those who are wicked, but you can certainly say no when the temptation arises. My friends, I hope that you have been blessed and challenged by hearing the rest of the story of Noah's life. Let's pray.